said it was going to lower the tariff, but then through like revisions, it ended up like having more like taxes.
Yeah, he does. Is it Payne Aldrich? Payne Aldrich?
Yeah, it was something with
Yeah.
Aldrich again.
Yeah, I think it's Payne Aldrich. And these acts or whatever and tariffs are all named after people, and sometimes the same guy might work on multiple. That I believe that's the Payne Aldrich Act, and Maggie's gonna make sure we're.
Sorry.
That's okay. But that's good to know about. Taft does let the tariffs get totally out of hand. He
And
lets.
people were mad because
Sorry,
they
I'm
said
like
he
laying on your
promised to
desk.
lower them and he just went there.
Very good.
Yeah,
Right,
it's
and
going
that's
now.
and progressives lose favor with Taft because he lets the tariffs get out of hand, and he also drops the ball on conservation. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt was all into conserving the environment. Taft not so much. So they kind of lost favor with him a little bit. So that's a good thing. What else? And girls, you don't have to in your essay. Like you're gonna list so many things here in what you did for homework. You don't have to list every single thing, but think about your argument that you're making and how you can back it up. But you should absolutely mention the amendments, and then whatever else kind of backs up what you're saying. Gia.
Would like the WCTU and feminist groups fall under social?
Yes. So the WCTU is the Women's Christian Temperance. So temperance is important because temperance morphs into what? Do you guys know what temperance is, Natalie?
Temperance morphs into the 18th Amendment.
Good, it does. Very good. So temperance means you drink less, and then as women and Christian men, Christian ministers start pushing for that, it morphs into full-on prohibition. So temperance is drinking less and like tempering how much you consume as far as alcohol goes, and then it goes into full prohibition, which goes into the 18th Amendment, and that is very social. So that would be a good thing to put there. Good. What else, Natalie?
Under political and like kind of social,
Mhm.
I put Teddy Roosevelt passed the Food and Drug
Good.
Act to
Good.
go against like corruption from like medical companies, and then also the Meat Inspection Act, which when like Upton Sinclair, like through his article, he like
Good.
exposed the disgusting
Yeah.
conditions of the meat
Right.
industry.
Very good. So, and again, girls, some of these things fall into all three categories. When you're writing your essay, you can put it where you think it fits. So they could be political because they're laws, or they could be social because who do they benefit? They benefit society, right? So however you do it, just make sure you back it up. So, Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, both. And remember Teddy Roosevelt with the 3 C's? Did we talk about that? They benefit the consumer. That's one of the things that he fights for is protection of the consumer. Ellie?
I said the Sherman Antitrust Act and then
Good.
the Elkins Act.
Good.
Strengthen that.
Good. And the Hepburn Act, you can even say. So the Hepburn Act, the Elkins Act were both to combat railroads and what they were doing to the farmers. And the Sherman Antitrust Act. So what did you put those under, Ellie? Political or?
I did economic.
You could, and you can, girls, again, as long as you back it up with evidence. Certainly the Sherman Antitrust Act is trying to combat the big corporations, which is economic, okay? And what do we know about the Sherman Antitrust Act? Is it good, Natalie?
It was like really easy to get around.
Good, very weak, right? And it's gonna be buttoned up later, we'll see, by Woodrow Wilson with a different act. Well, you can add that too, it's called, did we get to that? I don't think we got to that yet, but the Underwood Tariff Act is check that. The Clayton Antitrust Act. Underwood is another one Wilson does, but that has to do with tariffs. So the Sherman Antitrust Act is going to later be solidified more with the Clayton Antitrust Act, if you want to add that too. We didn't get to that yet, but we will. What else? Natalie?
For social and also political kind of, I did the recall and
Good.
the
Excellent.
referendum,
Good.
and then that went with kind of the 17th Amendment, which was the
Good.
direct election of senators.
Good. So, girls, you can bundle all that stuff under political and call them electoral reforms. They're all electoral reforms. The recall, the initiative, the referendum, and the 17th Amendment are all ideas from. Do you guys remember who the guy was who started those ideas? He was a progressive governor from Wisconsin. That guy Robert M. La Follette, remember we talked about him, I think he might have been one of your words to study, one of your people to know in the vocab quiz. So he called that the Wisconsin idea, all those ideas, and then they got put through during the Progressive Era, okay? So they're all political reform. Good. What else? How about, what else for social? Think about social. Ellie.
Teddy Roosevelt passing the square deal.
Good, the square deal, he's worrying about society, right? He's worrying about the consumer, he's worrying about working conditions, right? Public health and safety, so they're the things that he wanted to combat. So he does some things there for workers. The strike, the coal workers in Pennsylvania went on strike and he got involved and helped negotiate a deal. You could mention Jane Addams, right? Jane Addams. The progressive movement, girls, is largely run by, yes, you have the three progressive presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, but you also have women who are working. Remember, middle-class women like Jane Addams who are educated, who really don't have anything else to do with their, because they're not accepted into business, to do with their degrees and their brains, and they want to help and they want to do something, so they start the settlement house movement, which evolves into other things, and it gives them a voice, and then they start working on suffrage too, right? And that the women's movement gets momentum again, okay? So you could mention all of that. Did we talk about, I think also it was one of your terms too, the social gospel? Did we talk about that?
Yes.
So what is the social gospel? What does that mean? We've done the gospel of wealth, which was Andrew Carnegie, right? What about, and we've done social Darwinism. What about the social gospel? What's that? Harriet?
Wasn't that like Andrew Carnegie's thing where he said like at the very end, like if you had a lot of wealth, like you needed to get rid of it and do good things?
That's good, Harriet. That's the gospel of wealth. There's a lot of gospels. That's the gospel of wealth. And that was his idea. The social gospel is a little bit different than that, Natalie.
Is that like the Christians felt that they like, because they're Christians and their like beliefs in the like Christian doctrine,
Yeah.
they like had to go and help the
Yeah.
poor people?
Right. It's living out we all know what the gospel is, right? Living out the gospel through good works. So, Harriet, if everybody, what Carnegie was doing was for like the really, really wealthy. Like we all can't give away 90% of our net worth. And if we did, it would probably be not a lot, right? So you can have 90% of, So, but for him, but for everybody else, what can everybody else do? What can regular people do? They can give their time and their talent, right? So it is a very Christian thing, not necessarily Catholic, but Christian. Like, it's kind of like the mission that we know, serve the dear neighbor. And I'm not saying these ladies were nuns, or these ladies weren't Catholic, they were Christian though. So the gospel's the gospel, no matter what form of Christianity you are. So they're living out Jesus' good works through doing stuff in society, hence the social part. So social gospel is living out the gospel in society. Of those who have much, much is expected. So someone like a Jane Addams, who was more well-to-do, had an education, she felt she needed to give back. So that's her way of giving back. And this social gospel movement was a bunch of women like her. So you have to also talk about, when you're talking about your social paragraph, talk about the role of women, because it does empower them to then fight for the right to vote. Okay, there's a reason the 19th Amendment happens during this time period. What's the other reason? Why do you think Woodrow Wilson in 1920 is finally going to say, okay, fine, you guys can vote, after they've been berating him for several years? What is that on the tail end of? Go ahead, Ellie.
World War I.
Good, World War I.
They were like all home while the men were away.
Yep. So World War I is chapter 29, but women are going to fill in jobs in the factories and they're going to run the home front. And we're going to see when we talk about World War I and World War II, what happens at home is just as important as what happens on the battlefield, right? And the ladies keep things going. So at the end, he was like, you know what, we're going to give you guys the right to vote. So between the women who are fighting, like the Jane Addams and all these ladies, they find a voice, they push, then World War I happens, and then women's suffrage happens in 1920, okay? What else? Did we mention the Tenement Act? There was the Tenement Act of 1901, which could be social or political because it's a law, but remember Lillian Wald, I feel like we talked about her. She was Jane Addams' friend, but she had settlement houses in New York. And she pushed for, it's like cleanliness. The idea is, girls, that women, and I might have already told you this, like women are the caretakers of the home. You put that into society, women are the caretakers of society. They want to keep it clean and keep people safe. So Lillian Wald fought for the Tenement Act, which seems so basic to us today, but it was for plumbing and lighting in the tenements. And like when I say plumbing, it was like one toilet per 2 families, but it was better than an outhouse. And what does that cut down on? Disease. And that's a lot of what these ladies are combating: disease, workplace injuries. Also, too, girls, children. Who was the lady who fought for children? Against child labor? Florence, excuse me, remember Florence Kelly? Florence Kelly is going to start local in Chicago. Illinois is going to outlaw it. It's a battle that's hard to win because parents are on board with it because they want the money, but she pushes for the rights of children, okay? So people like that you can mention. That's social, okay? What else? Does anybody else have anything on their list that we didn't mention that you feel needs to be mentioned? Okay, and that's not maybe every single thing, but that's a good list. You could go at the end of the chapter, you know, the blue chronology little section. You can go down there and see what's important, maybe make a list. On the planning guide that's on Canvas, at the bottom it says synthesize. We don't call it that anymore. They changed the rubric a little bit, so they don't call it synthesis. But that's when you know how you get points for connecting to another time period? That's what they're talking about there. So synthesize means to make a connection to and bring it all together. So most people are pretty good with that, but sometimes if you're losing points on your essays, it's because you didn't make a connection. So either go back to the Gilded Age and talk about how it caused all these problems, or maybe go into the future and talk about the New Deal and some of these labor laws aren't going to become national laws. Like G mentioned, Mueller versus Oregon, that was just women. There aren't going to be, do you guys know what the, some of you have jobs, right? What are the maximum number of hours in a week you can work before you get overtime?
40.
40. So that wasn't established until the 1930s, right? And it's usually an 8-hour workday. And beyond that, you have to be compensated with breaks or whatnot. And all that stuff doesn't happen until the Fair Labor Standard Act, which is part of the New Deal. So you could allude to that, right? That's something in the future that you could allude to. Who is, and G, I'll answer your question, I'm sorry. Who is sort of left out? Like if you, girls, there's also, and I'm not gonna beat it to death because I feel like maybe I already have, but if you go into this book here, defining the period, there's a thing that does, like, what page is it? DP 13, if you wanna do that on your own. What is the progressive period? What makes it progressive on one side? And on the other side, what contradicts it? So who is not really benefiting from progressivism, Natalie?
I mean, the African Americans.
And?
And the Native Americans.
Good. So any kind of minority group, African Americans, Native Americans, even in some cases Mexican Americans, people who are coming into this country for work. God bless you. You could mention even some of the immigrants are still struggling. You know, so think about what is not progressive about the time period, and you could mention that too. Gee, what were you gonna say?
So I know how we put the progressive amendments all under political.
Yeah.
But if
You don't have to.
so could I put one in social, one in political?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, like so the senator one, that's very political. Prohibition is a social thing. Income tax is economic, and women's suffrage is political. I mean, you can really, as long as you back it up and it makes sense and it flows, you can do whatever. Some people go all political, here's all the laws, but that's great. That would be a good essay. That would be fine. Okay? All right, so you feel good about that? So we won't go over this anymore. You're on your own to plan, and then we'll do it in class. I believe it's 40 minutes, so it'll be time. So that's our next thing, and I would like to stick with the calendar. Even if something on Thursday happens, I'll communicate with you guys on Canvas, unless you're all without power or something, but as long as we can do stuff from home, we'll try and stick through it, okay? Alright, so we are on chapter 28. Yep. Does anybody know exactly what slide? Caitlin says in the middle. And Sarah's not here. And that's her job. So,
The last thing I have is IAPUSH.
okay. Alright, so let's take a look. So as I record this, I'm not sure the other class, I think they are behind you now. We'll see. Alright, so Ida Tarbell, was it her picture, that, or further?
I had
Oh, okay, yeah, we were probably here.
Yeah.
Okay, alright. So, she is then a muckraker, right? Ida Tarbell is considered a muckraker too. She exposes Rockefeller for his unethical practices, okay? Alright, I think we might have been. We were on that one, Shane?
Yes, I think
Okay.
we're on this first.
This year? Yeah, okay. So girls, the goals of the progressives would be some of the things we already said about Teddy Roosevelt. Use state power to control trust. The government, whether it's the state or the federal government, needs to oversee some of the things going on in business because it's gotten out of hand. Improve public health and safety and working conditions for people. And try and get the power back in the hands of the people instead of being in the corporate elite, okay? So that's basically where we are. Alright, so these are the things that Natalie mentioned, the electoral reforms. Again, all the idea of Bob La Follette, okay, who was a progressive governor from Wisconsin. They called his ideas the Wisconsin idea, referendum, recall, initiative, the 17th Amendment, okay? Which, these were some of your vocab words, so we won't beat those to death either. But there are things that were put in place that were much needed to change the electoral system. This is Karl Marx. Girls, why might people be, and if you look at this cartoon, this kind of depicts what we're about to talk about, but why might people be interested in socialism and communism during this time period? Nora?
Because the eventual goal of socialism and communism is to have everyone equal.
Good.
And when there's a lot of discontent among the poorer classes especially, they these ideas sort of come about where it's well, why can't we're all equal, one of them is we're all equal in the eyes of God, so why can't we just all be equal? But it just doesn't work because of life.
Right. Right. So to Americans who are capitalists, right, we find especially communism to be something that we detest, right? So these ideas certainly are not invented during this time period, but like Nora said, the conditions that people are living in are making people seem like it might be a good idea. They're thinking it might be a good idea. So Karl Marx and this guy Friedrich Engels were Germans who Karl Marx wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto, and he talked about bringing everybody to the same level and making everybody equal. So in places where there's tremendous poverty and there's a huge discrepancy, like Nora said, between the rich and the poor, you do see where people might be interested in communism. So because during this time period there was such a large working poor class, there were so many people, and they felt that no one was really helping them or listening to them, and that they were being abused in the workplace by not having any rights. So to them, socialism or communism might bring them up and put everybody on the same playing field, so it might be appealing. So there were some groups, and that's why a lot of employers are fearful of, during this time period, are fearful of labor unions, because they feel like workers uniting kind of sounds like something that would be in the Communist Manifesto. They don't like the sound of that, so they really resist the labor union. So to some people, it's appealing during this time period. The very poor working class would be interested in it. Remember I said Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, was a socialist, and he was writing an article for a socialist magazine, and that's how he ended up writing The Jungle. So the workers, he was more interested in the workers than he was the meat, but it ended up being such a tale about the meat that that's what people stuck with. So you see here, so what's going on here? So we saw this before. Remember a similar cartoon with the farmers? In the middle, it was like, we feed you all, and then it had everybody. So this is like, the people down below, the working class, it says, we feed you all. So this is workers and farmers, right? We eat for you, we shoot at you, we fool you, we rule you. This is capitalism. So what is this person's view of capitalism? Go ahead, Caitlin.
That a lot of people, or a very large group of people, work really hard and struggle a lot in order to benefit a small group of capitalists.
Good, and they're doing the brunt of it, right? They're bearing this is also like another cartoon we saw that our short answer was on, remember? Where they were all, the workers were holding up the robber barons. So it's the bulk of society is doing all the work, holding up everybody, supporting everybody else, right?
Money is in control all day on top.
Good, so money's at the top, so that's the be all end all, that's the pinnacle of everything, very good. What else? What is it, who's here, we fool you all?
Religious leaders.
Yeah, so there's an idea that they're using religion maybe to keep these people in place and keep them doing what they're doing, to try and rule. There's that idea as well. So girls, we'll see when we get into I think it's chapter 29, with World War I, the Russians have a revolution, and the workers and the farmers take over, and that becomes, they turn the government into a communist government. They oust the Tsar of Russia, they kill him and his family, and they take over. And that becomes the Russian Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, and then communism becomes something that's on the world stage that people are like, oh my goodness. So it becomes a bigger concern when that happens. But right now, it really is something that workers and farmers might be thinking of because they feel like they're in this position, okay? All right, so World War I we're gonna talk about in the next chapter. This Jane Addams is in this picture somewhere. I'm not sure which one exactly is her, but she is an advocate for peace during World War I. She actually wins the Nobel Peace Prize. So this is just because she's in this chapter. Okay. All right. So Bob La Follette, we talked about. Another progressive governor was Hiram Johnson from California. So there are a lot of progressives in politics besides Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. There were a lot of the progressives are Republicans. They're just progressive Republicans. The progressives weren't an actual political party that you went and voted for. The presidents, and really girls, you can be a Democrat too, because Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. And if you look at his policies and put them side by side with Teddy Roosevelt and Taft, you'll see that their ideals are pretty much in line. So progressivism really could cross party lines. It just so happens that Roosevelt and Taft were Republicans, and then Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat, but they all three identified with being progressive. And I guess that could be true of governors and other people in politics. Progressivism was more of an idea, okay? But a lot of the Republicans were progressive. Okay, so this is Florence Kelly. Maybe this is why you didn't know before when I said Florence Kelly. This is what I mean, girls, when I say women were advocates. Women champion the progressive movement. It's sort of a grassroots movement that starts at the local level and works their way up. Okay, so when you want to change something, you don't go right to Washington and try and get an amendment. That's not how it works. You start locally, and that's where these ladies have success. So Florence Kelly's gonna have success in her home state, and then she's gonna keep, trying to have success at the national level. Did I tell you that women also fight for the rights of consumers too, because who is usually the main decision maker in a household as a consumer, if you think about your own household? So,
The mom.
right, does your dad, the male in the household, does he usually care what kind of soap you use, or women become very valuable. Actually, one of the early industries where women are able to find employment is in advertising, because the big companies find their opinion to be very valuable, and then they work as artists and writers and things like that in the advertising industry early in like the 19-teens and the 1920s. That's one of the first kind of breakthrough, besides like the caring professions. Do you know what I mean? Like pink collar, do you know what I mean when I say pink collar work? Like what would a pink collar job be? Nora?
Nursing,
No, good, nursing,
teaching.
Good. So if you were a woman during this time period and you had an education and you wanted to work, people would be like, be a nurse or a teacher. Beyond that, you weren't taken very seriously. I mean, you could do clerical stuff, like with like a high school diploma. You could, as long as you were English speaking, American born, you could do bookkeeping, secretarial work, but beyond that, there weren't many opportunities. Hence the movement. All these ladies were smart, middle-aged, they might have been middle-aged, middle class women who, wanted to do something. So a little bit later, we'll see a lot of them become valuable in consumers. So you see Florence Kelly early on, they know that women have value in that industry. Florence Kelly also fights for, I don't know if I told you this story, that if you were like a little kid and you say you stole an apple or something because you were hungry, you would be put in the same prison with like rapists and murderers because there was no juvenile court system. So she starts pushing for that. So agencies there's no like Department of Health and Human Services during this time period. So, slowly they're gonna start to find better ways to care for children. Okay, so Florence Kelly is instrumental in that. Okay, and girls, the idea of a club movement, and I say this a lot, like when people are upset about something, they form a group and the group starts championing for their cause. And that's how this kind of starts, right? Women start saying, well, this isn't working, what can we do? And they get together, and it's sort of a grassroots movement. So this is what G said earlier. Mueller versus Oregon is a victory for the progressives, for workers. And girls, in your essay, you always know when you write Supreme Court cases, they're in italics, right? So that's a big deal, but the length of a workday doesn't become a national law until the 1930s, right? So this is just for women, not men. They felt it was bad for women's health, okay? If you think about during this time period how hard it was to be a working mother, these ladies had to, schlep water from the bottom of the tenement all the way up. The women were becoming exhausted by working in those conditions. Lochner versus New York is not a success. It says that the hours for bakers in New York was put at 10, and then this changed that. So this wasn't great.